So one thing, most of this presentation is mostly about how the economy works, not why we're doing what we're doing currently, which is necessarily not because we run the economy poorly currently, and we're not necessarily doing it correctly. I didn't want to really talk about that, although I'm going to have to a bit more in the future episodes. But one last one I did want to do is, because it really irks me, is that mainstream economics doesn't tell people correctly why economic growth had to be pursued. So we're going to run through that in this episode. So here I've got a timeline, and that's in lots of 20 years. And because in this example we're going to consider generations being 20 years apart, and what I want to graph on this graph is resource use over a person's lifetime. Now I know when a person is born, say a first person is born, of course their food and their clothing is going to go up over time and then kind of peak or whatever. But just to make things simple, we're just going to assume that, like, if your adult use of resources is here, that you go straight up and then it's just flat for the rest of your life. And we're going to assume that people live till they're 80 and then they die, right? So this is the block of a model of use of a person over their lifetime, just one person's life. So then that person has kids at age 20, the next generation comes along, and so if we start putting their resource consumption on here as well, we'll see we get a block there, and then another block, and each group has to get 4 blocks. And then, because I want the top line of this graph to be total resource use, but see, because our other person died, then here we only got the one person alive. So again, so now we have another generation come in, and we're going to add another block of resource use. Then that drops down, there's 2 people alive there, and then that one drops, so there's still only one person alive here. And then, you'll see where I'm going with this in a second. Another person comes along, the 4th generation now, so this is generation 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the rest of the number 4's resource use is all down, this is all number 4's, 4 blocks. And then we can see that from this point forward, if we have a 5th generation, they're going to follow the same pattern as generation 4, in that there's their resource block usage. Generation 5 runs down here. And if no one ever used it, you'd see that this graph's just going to, for more and more generations, the population's reached a steady state, and that would just continue on out that way. Now the thing is, let's say that this first 20 years of this person's life was just involved in the resources in building a house. Now I know that's unrealistic, but this is a hypothetical. So then, and the same with this person, number 2's first 20, number 3's first 20, and number 4's first 20, no, 1, 2, 3, yes, number 4, hang on. Where does this one end? This one ends there. Yep. So what happens though is that number 4 has to have a house as well. Sorry, just remembering how to do this. Okay. So number 5 though, because houses last longer than 80 years, when number 5 comes along, if this house was still alive, still in good nick that this person had when they died at 80, then number 5 doesn't need this first block of resource use here, or not as much anyway, because they might only have a small block. We'll just go half. Because they were able to use the house that number 1 built. And the point I'm trying to make here is that if we correlate resource use to employment, because for food and houses and clothing and that sort of stuff, the more any of those you need, the more people you have employed for a given level of productivity to do them, then, so this graph here is a graph of employment, essentially, and then employment would have been constant here, except for what's going to happen is, because number 5 doesn't need to build a new house, there's going to be less resource needed because we can continue to use old resource. And if we'd find that over time, that the amount of resource use needed drops off, which means the amount of employment will drop off. And so that's why we've had to have a perennially growing population. So to compensate for this drop-off and the drop-off of employment that would occur, what we did to correct this back up here, all we did is like keep expanding our population. Population keeps growing up, and that compensates for productivity and long life things lasting longer and decreasing the resource use. Now, that's okay to an extent until we like risk becoming unsustainable and using up all our planet's resources. And then it becomes totally unproductive and unsustainable and illogical and that sort of thing. But you never hear mainstream economics ever say that's why economic growth had to happen. Economic growth is about population growth, which is for the purposes of keeping unemployment at an acceptable level, and I'll just put acceptable in inverted commas. So we're trying to keep unemployment at say 5% or 7% or 4, 5, 7% or something like that. It's not totally unacceptable to me, but if you didn't have with the current economic setup that we have with private sector dominated economy and the way we do it and free floating wages, if you don't have economic and population growth, then your unemployment rate will simply start ramping up and up and up. So to 10, 15, 20%. So without a job, or you have a job guarantee, which is by far the way it should have been done, but wasn't invented till 10, 15 years ago, so no one knew about it. But now we know we could get the best of both worlds. We don't have to have population growth, don't necessarily have to have economic growth in the traditional sense of like more consuming of resources, and we can keep unemployment even lower. We can get it down to 1 to 2% with the job guarantee. So just wanted to put that in there because, man, it irritates me that this is never stated correctly in any economic mainstream sort of education.